our first speaker. I would like to express my sincere appreciation for you accepting to be with us today. Thank you. Thank you very much, Shonali.
Yes,
Our
good morning.
desire was to celebrate this 10th anniversary with a return to business as usual, to our international meetings and social relations in person, and to being able to embrace our friends when we meet again. It is not entirely possible yet, but we would like to share with those of you who are streaming and those of you who are here present the joy of being together again in a big virtual embrace. In this 10th edition, we are going to work on and debate green opportunities for the energy sector. The objective of climate change mitigation is a challenge for all countries. The commitment to carbon neutrality by 2050 involves a transition that may be difficult and costly in the short term, but which represents a great opportunity to achieve a sustainable and inclusive development model. These climate scenarios require a profound transformation of society and our production system. The European Union has expressed its views along these lines. The path outlined by the Green Deal is based on the implementation of a broad, diverse, and complementary set of policies and proposals in the areas of climate, energy, transport, industry, biodiversity, education and training, financing, and taxation, all of which are based on cooperation between public administration and business. In the case of the European Union member states, for the first time, and leaving aside discrepancies, an impressive array of resources has been put in place to tackle the necessary investments and achieve a socially just transition. In the field of energy, in our field, the increase of renewable energies, the advance of energy efficiency, and the reduction of emissions require a revision of the regulatory framework and new policies. In this way, the increase in renewable energies needs to be accompanied by a smart and efficient network with new regulatory criteria, from my point of view, regarding the location of generation to provide more efficient markets. Also, improvements in energy efficiency will not be possible without a very fast deployment of a structural change in buildings. Very difficult issue, but is a key point to achieve the issue of energy efficiency. And emission reduction. Emission reduction requires an extension, a tightening of ETS, but in no case should this cost be passed on to the consumer. In addition, it is essential to implement new measures to facilitate the energy transition. I am referring, among other tools we can develop, to the tax harmonization in energy prices, at least among the European members in Europe, of course. Subsidies in environmental investments, especially in R&D, and a change in the training criteria for vocational education from on-site and from the other side in company training for employees, for all employees, of course, but especially for redundant employees, in order to avoid new pockets of vulnerable families. This should entail a change, a profound change in banking system regulation for green finance and guidelines, and lastly, temporary tax relief for Green Deal investments. Contributions from academia are always very important, but I think in this moment are much more important than ever. In order to make the Green Deal a real and socially just achievement. In this context, the symposium is set up as a forum for discussion and analysis of the current challenges, with the aim of contributing new ideas and proposals in the shaping of this new sustainable energy model. And now, let's move on to tables. Table 1, shared by Elisa Trujillo, is focused in energy affordability. Firstly, the paper presented by Gerald Zunka from Ruhr University Bochum, titled Encouraging Consumer Activity Through Automatic Switching of the Electricity Contract, a Field Experiment, obtains very, very interesting and useful results for policy regulation in retail markets in order to make them more competitive. The next two papers study how the conditions of energy poverty could affect energy affordability and climate change mitigation policies. Daniel Davi from the chair, is a member of the chair of Energy Sustainability, Barcelona University and IEB, looks into economic efficiency and the CO2 impacts of the Clean Cooking Stove program in Ecuador. The aim of the program is to reduce LPG subsidies and improve environmental conditions for the population. And Federico Accursi from University of Navarra analyzes the determinants and incentives of households in rural areas of Guatemala to connect to the electricity grid, placing a special emphasis on the role of connection reliability and affordability. The speakers of the second table, shared by Paulina Beato, will debate green markets. In this vein, the research of Tore Hamas from Copenhagen School of Energy Infrastructure is an empirical study on the transmission of risk signals between green asset markets and commodity markets, including oil or natural gas, to precious metal markets. Maria Eugenia Sanin from University of Paris-Saclay, the second speaker of this table, explores the role of the free allocation of European allowances in the European emissions trading system on the crude steel industry, emphasizing incentives for decarbonization in this sector. And Ronald Wiseman from Erasmus School of Economics studies US municipal bonds to examine whether mitigation and adaptation initiatives to address climate change risks are recognized or accepted in financial markets. It's a new challenge. The last table addresses sustainable solutions. We have the invaluable presence of Andreas Loscher as chair. Thank you. The first paper presented by Victor Kahn from called the Mine Paris Tech studies the impact of residential energy retrofit investments on energy expenditures and carbon emissions in France. Next, Kinga Szorzeska from ZEW of Mannheim, a member also of Chair of Energy Sustainability, Barcelona University and IB, analyzes the direct and indirect effects of a subsidy program targeting environmental investment for technology adoption and environmental R&D expenditure in Dutch manufacturing companies between 1999 and 2011. The results show that the environmental subsidy program stimulates environmental investments for technology adoption and environmental R&D expenditure. And finally, Jorge Uribe from Open University of Catalonia proposes a novel methodology to set the price of insurance contracts for renewable energy generation projects, focusing on managing the risk associated with weather conditions and when there is a lack of long historical financial records. Finally, I would like to express my gratitude to keynote speakers, Professor Shonali Pachauri and Benjamin Sabakul, who will be in charge of the closing session. And now it's my pleasure to present Shonali. Shonali Pachauri is the research group leader of the new Transformative Institutional and Social Solutions Research Group in the Energy, Climate and Environment Program at the International Institute for Applied System Analysis in Vienna, Austria. She was also professor at the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. She holds her PhD from the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich and her master from University College London. Shonali Pachauri's research focuses on the role of technological, institutional, and social innovations for inclusive human development, particularly for those without access to basic energy infrastructure and other modern services. She studies the policy pathways to achieve this universal access and assesses the broader impacts of this for sustainable development. She has published extensively on these topics, both in the form of peer-reviewed scientific articles and policy briefs. Her works have been cited almost 10,000 times. Shonali Pachauri is a lead author for the IPCC report and was a coordinated lead author for the Global Energy Assessment. She serves on the Science Advisory Panel for the Climate and Clean Air Coalition and on the advisory group for the International Network on Gender and Energy. Thank you very much, Shonali, for accepting to be the keynote speaker in this 10th symposium. Shonali, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Costa, and good day, good morning to all of you over there. It's my great pleasure to be able to give this keynote speech and to start off the symposium. I thank the organizers and the University of Barcelona for giving me this opportunity. I'm going to try and share my slides. I'm going to open them now, and hopefully that works. I think it's taking a minute or two, but anyway, I will start already to say a little bit about what I'm hoping to present. So my keynote speech is on universal access to modern energy services, development imperative, and climate opportunity. And largely what I want to cover during the next few minutes is really explaining a little bit about how there are huge inequalities today in terms of access to energy services and what this really means for welfare for people around the world, and also how this links to the issue of climate change. So today we know that we are living in a world where energy services are really the engine to modern life. We know that energy is fundamental to all aspects of living. And even so, we live in a world where energy access and use is very inequitably distributed. So, about a billion people are without access to electricity, over 3 billion without clean cooking access, and the average use of modern energy in the developed world is 10 to 20 times more that in least developed nations. We also know that our existing fossil based energy systems are damaging to the environment, damaging to human health, and to people, to crops and biodiversity. And therefore, we cannot continue with the existing system that we have. As has already been alluded in the opening, we need transformation. Unfortunately, historically, we've seen that energy transitions have occurred at a very slow pace. And therefore, this is a big challenge to society today because we need unprecedented rates of transformation by 2030, 2050 in order to avoid the most dangerous impacts of climate change. We also know that investments for power and electric infrastructure have a long lifetime and are also expensive. And therefore, in terms of financial sector, there are also challenges associated with this transformation. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, we are living today in a world of extreme disparities when it comes to energy use and emissions. And I want to dwell on this in a couple of slides in what follows. This is a map that many of you may have already seen, may be very familiar with in any case. It's basically average energy use per person by nation, showing you the differences across the globe. And what is very evident is, of course, the fact that there are parts of the world where there is kind of energy abundance, and then there are other parts of the world where there is energy poverty. And these areas, of course, are not uncorrelated with areas of general poverty and low economic development. So, of course, we know that energy is highly correlated with development, and therefore, in order to really give the opportunities for development to all of the world, we really do need to provide access to modern energy services everywhere. In recent research, we've also seen that basically the inequalities in energy use are not just spatial, they're across people. And we know that amongst the poorest population, the lowest 40% uses less than 10 gigajoules per capita and contributes about only 10% of global energy use, whereas the top 10% of population uses over 200 gigajoules per capita and contributes to over a third of total energy use. And these inequalities in energy, which are depicted here in the graph by a Lorenz curve or a series of Lorenz curves, actually show very clearly that in certain end uses of energy, in particular those for transport, the inequalities are even more extreme. So, in particular, for air transport or land transport, it's really only the top 30% of the population that uses most of the energy associated with this end use. Of course, these inequalities in energy use are then also mirrored in inequalities in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, cumulative greenhouse gas emissions. So, what this graph from Oxfam really shows is the disparities in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions across populations. And what's again very, very clear here is that in terms of total cumulative emissions over the period from 1990 to 2050, we see that the poorest 50% really account for, about less than 5% of cumulative emissions, whereas the richest 10% account for almost half of that. So, again, huge disparities in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions cumulatively over the last 20, 30 years. Now, when we talk about energy access, we have many different ways of defining it and measuring it. And it's important to say what we mean by modern energy access, because different people have different understandings of what this is. And if we look at the SDG 7 goals for 2030, there are clear definitions and a clear tracking of the status of these over time as well. 7.1 is basically the goal of universal access to modern energy services, whereas 7.2 is increasing the share of renewable energy, and 7.3 is doubling the rate of energy efficiency improvements. But even if we look at just the target for 7.1, there are, again, differences in terms of what are officially reported as estimates of population without access to modern energy services, and then what other researchers and scientists are looking and calculating, estimating the number of people without access. So officially in 2019, about 2.6 billion were estimated without clean cooking access. But in fact, over 4 billion people are estimated to continue to use dirty fuels, because even though they may primarily rely on a clean cooking fuel, as a backup, they're still using dirty fuels. Again, in terms of access to electricity, about 759 million were estimated without access in 2019 globally. But in fact, if you consider how many are without reliable electricity supply, the number is much higher at about 3.5 billion. So, in fact, there are new frameworks that have been defined to measure energy poverty, and the World Bank's multi-tier framework is one such framework. It's a big advancement over existing binary indicators because it looks at different dimensions of energy access, and it distinguishes not just those who have access from those that don't have access, but then, in fact, distinguishes between different tiers of access, as shown here in the slide. So some who have very little access, and then others who have more access, and so on. But even though this is a very, very major advancement over other existing binary indicators, there are some definitional and measurement issues with the existing multi-tier framework. Even today, this framework relies and focuses largely on the supply side to capture access to services, not so much on consumption and demand. It also defines access in terms of consumption, which may undermine efficiency goals. Then there are some dimensions like affordability that are poorly captured by the indicators that are defined. Um, and the normative thresholds for reliability, legality, and quality that are applied in the framework may have difficulty to be universally accepted, because in different political and cultural contexts they may not be as applicable. And also, the aggregates that are defined are very sensitive to the algorithmic changes in terms of how the overall energy poverty definition is applied. So, as an alternative, we have defined another framework, which we call the alternative framework. And this basically builds on the multi tier framework, but simplifies it and refines it further in some ways. And in two recent publications, we basically explain how the framework is defined, explain the indicators that are used, and then apply the framework to measure energy access, energy poverty in a set of 10 countries, looking at both the official access. So basically, what we see in these graphs are in purple, the populations that are unserved, that means do not have any electricity access. Then in the green, populations that are counted as served by official indicators. And then the yellow shows you what is actually the status of access in these countries when you consider actually the application of the alternative framework that we define. And in terms of the alternative framework, we define electricity access as those people having more than 16 hours per day and being able to enjoy decent energy services. That means more than just a light bulb, which is often what is defined as access in many other cases, and have the ability to afford adequate energy services. So, expenditures on electricity being less than 5% of total household budget. And similarly, we define access to clean cooking as having fuels, blend fuels are biogas, liquefied petroleum gas, electricity, or natural gas fuels, which are considered clean cooking fuels for 10 months of the year or more. And again, having expenditures on cooking of less than 5% of total household budget. And what is very evident from our analysis is that actually the measures of access, by applying the applied framework, are much lower than the official measures. So, actually, access is an even bigger issue when we apply this framework. So, of course, the big question is, when we talk about energy access, we want to be able to provide access that provides welfare benefits and can be used also productively to improve well-being. So the big question is, how much energy does one need in this case? And this is a question that is not a new question. It has been researched since the time of the first oil crisis in the 1970s, actually, and at the time when limits to growth was a big issue. The seminal work in this case is by Professor Jose Goldenberg, who estimated back in the mid 1980s that 1 kilowatt per capita was enough for providing basic energy services. Since then, of course, there have been many other estimates of energy needed for decent living. Those that look at only the direct energy needs, others that look at basic needs, including direct and indirect energy needs, and then other estimates that have tried to look at macro correlations between the Human Development Index and energy consumption. And all of these estimates differ and also have different assumptions behind them, but they are largely macroeconomic in the way that they are estimated or either using engineering or econometric methods. Alternatively, you can take a bottom-up view of energy needs. And this is research that has been done at my institute by co-authors of mine as well. And in this particular slide, it shows a basket of energy needs that are considered essential for decent living and that have an energy intensity that matters, particularly for energy use and climate change. And this includes, in addition to lighting and mobile phones, which are considered sort of very basic in most cases, also things like schooling, healthcare, refrigeration, clean water, sanitation, mobility, transport, adequate nutrition, and so on and so forth. And these are a set of minimum need satisficers and the thresholds that are estimated as being important for decent living services. This is, of course, not meant to be a comprehensive list of all things that are important to well-being, but those that have important energy and material requirements and therefore can have implications for climate change. And of course, one could start with a completely different basket and different thresholds. But this is based on empirical research that has been done looking at variations across countries and across time. So understanding what the energy requirements are for satisfying these basic needs is research that has been conducted recently within my institute. And the first step to doing that is sort of identifying where these decent living services are met and where there are big gaps in this. And the global map here and the graphs that are shown show regionally where there are gaps in terms of decent living services around the globe. And not surprisingly, sub-Saharan Africa and parts of South and Southeast Asia, parts of Central America are regions where there is still big gaps in terms of meeting these decent living services for all. So in terms of the energy requirements, both the energy for building the infrastructure for providing these services, as well as the running energy for this have been estimated in our research. And basically, for provisioning of all the infrastructure, for shelter, for public transport, for roads, for schools and hospitals, and so on and so forth, to provide these services in regions where they don't exist, is of the order of 12 exajoules until 2040. This seems like a large number, but it's less than 3% of current energy use. Of course, certain regions like Africa and South Asia will need much more than others, where these services already exist. Energy for running these energy services basically is estimated at about 17 gigajoule per capita. This is, of course, much lower than the current average energy use of between 55 to 60 gigajoules per capita, which is the current estimate globally. Now, of course, while these services are universal, the energy requirements for meeting them are not, because in some parts of the world, the needs are different from other parts of the world. So in regions where there's more cooling or more heating required, the energy needs will be different. And moreover, energy intensities in different parts of the world are very different. So in fact, what this graph shows is the fact that globally, the threshold for meeting decent living energy, which is the black line, is differing across different regions of the world. And this can vary from 9 to 36 gigajoule per capita per year. And in certain regions, this threshold has already been exceeded, mainly in OECD regions, as you can see here. In other regions of Africa, South Asia, and so on, we are way below the threshold even now. What is important, of course, is that even meeting this threshold with today's technologies actually results in a, an additional energy requirement which is not in exceedance of the projections of energy demand under stringent mitigation scenarios. So, in other words, the important takeaway from this research is that providing universal access to energy services is not in any way going to harm the climate any further, and basically can happen within the existing amount of energy that is available globally. But of course, there is redistribution required in order to provide everyone with the same basic energy services at a minimum. Of course, the big question is how to achieve these two goals synergistically. And here again, we have done some research for sub Saharan Africa. This is a slightly complicated slide, but I will walk you through it. Basically, we ran a bunch of scenarios using two different modeling setups. And in the baseline scenarios, we basically considered current policies which don't actually achieve universal access by 2030, as is in the SDGs targeted. Then we have a universal access scenario, UNIV-AC, as is shown here, which only achieves the universal access target. Then you have the access efficiency scenario, which basically achieves universal access with also achieving the efficiency target of the SDG. And then you have the access renewable scenario, which is universal access and the renewable target. And finally, a scenario that achieves all three, which is access efficiency REN, which is basically looking at achieving all three targets simultaneously. And the key takeaway from that research is basically that achieving all three targets simultaneously rather than doing them independently can be extremely beneficial because it results in less emissions, it results in less investments required, and lower energy demand per capita because of improved efficiency as well. So it's really a win-win-win strategy to do it in this way. So I'm just going to make a few last remarks. I'm mindful of the time, and I know that we want to also have enough time for some questions and discussions. So I leave you with a few key takeaways from this research. One is, of course, that providing modern energy services for decent living for all is absolutely essential. Without that, we cannot have equity, we cannot have an inclusive transformation to a better, more sustainable future, and provide everyone with equal opportunities for development and well-being. We also know that this has to be done while we decarbonize our energy supply systems. So we really need to upscale investments and innovations in renewable sources, while at the same time sort of retiring old fossil infrastructure and disinvesting from fossil fuels. More importantly, there is a lot that can be done on the demand side, and this is often not focused on sufficiently. But basically, there's a huge potential to reduce, reuse, and recycle energy and materials. And this really needs to be done simultaneously. It's not something that can happen later on. Finally, electrification and digitalization provide huge scope also for improvements in efficiency, for decarbonization, and for providing access to universal services, to decent services universally. So I'll end with that. And I thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy to take questions and comments. And these are just some resources we have at IIASA for students that you might want to check out.
I saw that Frank Cohen asked to me to put a question to you. Very quick and a very quick answer also, please.
Well, thank you very much for this very interesting landscape presentation of the issues at stake. A general question that I have, so like, because we're talking about this lack of investment, and well, high-income countries have said that they would commit to invest, and at the end of the day, they have not invested as much as they promised. So my general question to you would be how we can maybe incentivize or encourage these types of investments and make sure that we are investing enough in energy services in low and middle income countries.
Yeah. That's a very, very pertinent question. I thank you for it. So, in fact, I think there are many different things that can be done in terms of improving the investment flows. There are flows of investment that have to happen within countries. There are flows that happen internationally, and both of these are required really. Both public and private investment is required everywhere. I think science has a big role to play here, and I think the symposium that we are having here today is really also presenting some of the science in a very nice way. In fact, we know that a lot of the analysis that is done in terms of looking at the costs and benefits of different investments and infrastructure developments are incomplete in a sense because they don't look at many of the externalities that would happen if those investments were not in place or if other investments were made instead. And I think that's a big role for informing policy to really explain what the impacts, both in terms of health, in welfare, in productivity, that those investments can have. There's also a need for mobilizing internationally more finance to those regions and those areas of the world where there may not be enough internally to do those investments. So, I mean, I think that the kind of two-pronged strategy is required in this case. One is more science and innovation to explain what are the opportunities for investment, what are the benefits of those investments, not just the costs, but really looking at the benefits in a wider sense. And also then providing guidance on places in the world where those investments may not be internally happening and where there is really need to mobilize international finance.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Shonali, again for your very interesting presentation and answer. We are going to follow with our program, and now is the time for the first table. Thank you, Shonali.